Welcome to the final session of today. Most of you, or many of you, I'm sure, know that we are broadcasting this live online on ustream.com and also on Second Life, so hello to everybody. When we were planning this conference, we wanted to have a dimension about the effects of light pollution and health. And when we asked around, Graham Cliff and Bob Meisen immediately came back and said, you have to have Stephen Lockley talking. And unfortunately, Stephen isn't able to be here. But we're now having a virtual conference, broadcasting to an actual conference, broadcasting back out to another virtual conference. But we have Stephen Lockley on the phone from Harvard Medical School, where he is an assistant professor of medicine and an associate neuroscientist in the Division of Sleep Medicine. I hope I got that introduction right, Stephen, did I?
That's perfect, thank you.
Okay, well, I will hand over to you now, and take it away.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Good, thank you very much indeed to the organisers for inviting me to speak today. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person, but I hope this is nearly as good. You can hear me and you can see the slides. And so what I'd like to do today is review some of the biology of how light affects human physiology. And so, of course, we're concerned about the health effects of light pollution, of light exposure at night. But in order to really understand the potential risk to human health, we have to have a good understanding of how light affects us in order that we can build systems or have mechanisms to protect us from the potentially harmful effects of light at night. And so I'm not going to talk about data that talks directly about light pollution and their effects on sleep, but many of the considerations we have to think about in dealing with this potential problem, and then deciding how to go forward, what information do we need to find out next. And I don't need to tell this conference that, of course, we've evolved in a very distinct light-dark cycle, and all of our biology, psychology and metabolism is related to the 24-hour day-night light-dark cycle. And until 120 years or so ago, we only would have been exposed to that natural light-dark cycle. And, of course, with the advent of electric light, we're now able to do unnatural things and expose ourselves to light at night that we never would have seen before. And we interact with the environment in a very controlled way. In order for us to control our physiology and behavior in a way that makes sense with the 24-hour world, we have to have an internal clock to anticipate environmental time. And so the example I usually give for that is that the early bird needs to be awake before the worm in order to catch it. And so you can't have a system where both the worm and the bird wake up at the same time in response to light. The bird needs an internal clock to know that the worm will get up at a certain time tomorrow and be ready and waiting for it. And we have this biological clock. It's called the circadian pacemaker. Circadian meaning about a day, and so rhythms that have a period of about 24 hours are considered circadian. And this biological clock is situated in a part of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus, and it's a group of about 50,000 cells that sit just above the optic chiasm, either side of the third ventricle, that are all individual clocks. Each of those cells is a clock. If you take a single cell and measure its rhythm in vitro, you can measure 24-hour rhythms in the absence of any other time cues. And so these 50,000 cells are all individual oscillators, but in the brain as a group, they work together to provide output to all parts of the brain and the rest of the body to control 24-hour metabolism. And so you can think of many 24-hour rhythms that are controlled by this system, many behavioral and physiological rhythms such as the sleep-wake cycle, your alertness and performance patterns, your hormone production, temperature regulation, and metabolism are all under control of this clock to some degree. Here are examples from laboratory studies where we measure people's rhythms over a 32-hour period, and so we keep them awake in the lab for 32 hours straight to measure the timing of their internal clock without any external time cues. And so here in the top panel you can see a very distinct rhythm in your core body temperature, with a minimum at about 7 or 8 in the morning. Plasma melatonin, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, which is the hormone of darkness. It's the biochemical signal of darkness. has a very distinct rhythm with very low levels in the daytime, but then very rapid production throughout the night. Your eye blink rate slows down at night as a marker of fatigue. Your slow rolling eye movements, which are the time where your eyes roll in the back of your head just before you fall asleep. I hope there are none there at the moment. You can see rapidly increase during the night. You rate yourself more sleepy during the night. Your reaction time slows down dramatically to an average of about a second at night compared to maybe 300 or 400 milliseconds in the day. Your cognitive throughput slows, your memory capacity slows, and all of these behaviors, all of this physiology is controlled by this internal clock. And so we take for granted how important this clock is in mediating our physiology and behavior. But if we had a problem with this clock, we'd very soon notice it because all of these functions would start to become disordered. And so to understand how we might think of light's effects on the clock, we have to know a little bit about the neuroanatomy. And so here's a cartoon of the system. Light is detected exclusively by the eyes and only through the eyes to control these responses. And there's a dedicated monosynaptic tract from the eye to the body clock, to the suprachiasmatic nucleus here. And then there's another pathway going from the SCN via the spinal cord back to the pineal gland, which is the gland that produces melatonin, that hormonal signal of darkness. And so this pathway is a very good pathway to measure whether light is affecting the brain. Because the only way that we can affect our body rhythms with light or affect our pineal melatonin levels with light is to have a fully intact pathway from the eye to the SCN, eventually to the pineal. Now, in darkness, when there's no light exposure, the body clock still works. It still puts out a signal about once every 24 hours. And so signals go from this part of the brain to the pineal gland to tell the pineal gland to produce melatonin. And so if you have no light exposure, if you are totally blind, for example, or if you live in a cave, you still produce melatonin. You don't need light to control melatonin production. But in a light-dark cycle, light can do two things to melatonin levels. First of all, if you shine light into someone's eyes at night, that signal travels to the pineal gland and stops the production of melatonin. So melatonin is the signal of darkness. It is the hormonal, the biochemical signal of darkness. And if you shine light at someone's eyes at night, the body clock thinks it's daytime. And so it suppresses melatonin production. It stops its production. You can see it fall dramatically here. And then when you turn the lights off again, the levels come straight back up. And so if you shine light at someone's eyes at night, which is an unnatural thing to do, then you will tell the body clock it's daytime. The other thing that light-dark cycle does is reset your clock every day. And so if you don't get a proper light-dark exposure on a 24-hour basis, your body clock can't remain synchronized with the 24-hour day. And you've all experienced some of the problems associated with not having a good 24-hour light-dark cycle when you work shifts, when you work overnight, or if you go across time zones. You too rapidly change your light-dark exposure so that your body clock can't keep up. And as a result of that, you get shift work disorder, you get jet lag, and you have all the symptoms of sleeplessness, performance issues, metabolic problems, digestive disorders, and so on. And so we all take for granted, really, this 24-hour light-dark cycle, which is very important in maintaining all of our 24-hour rhythms. We do a lot of work with blind people where they've lost this light-dark input, and they immediately start to have circadian rhythm sleep disorders because their body clock can't remain synchronized on a nice 24-hour pattern. And so the first thing to make sure we do in using light and dark effectively is to make sure we have a distinct day-night cycle, which is, of course, what we evolved in. And so you want light days and dark nights in order to properly synchronize the biological clock. And so light is the most powerful time cue for resetting the circadian pacemaker and ensuring that we correctly synchronize this internal clock with the outside world. If you don't do that properly, if you fail to entrain the pacemaker, you have problems in all of the physiology and behavior that this clock controls. So sleep disorders, fatigue, performance issues, hormone disorders, metabolic disorders. And as I mentioned, common examples of circadian desynchrony, where the clock becomes desynchronized from the light-dark cycle, is shift work disorder, and there are, of course, millions of people who induce this because they work shifts. Jet lag, you travel across time zones, your body clock can't keep up. And then there are some more specialized sleep disorders called advanced and delayed sleep phase disorder, where your body clock is timed either slightly too early in advanced or slightly too late in delayed sleep disorder. And so if you don't get a proper light-dark exposure, you can cause problems with sleep and other systems. But light also has many other effects on human physiology. And so in addition to entraining the circadian pacemaker and phase shifting or resetting the timing of the clock, light has many other direct effects which are separate from the visual system. And by that, I mean, for example, suppressing the hormone melatonin, and I've shown you that example. Light also directly alerts the brain and it improves performance, and I'll show you data proving that in a moment. Light can also stimulate cortisol production in the morning, and cortisol is the hormone we produce just before we wake up. It's a signal to get us going in the day. Light also increases heart rate directly and can increase core temperature at night. The pupillary reflex is in fact a non-visual response to light. It's not controlled by the visual system at all. And there are also some clock genes that are directly increased in their expression directly by light. So all of these responses to light are daytime responses. And so if you shine light at someone's eyes at night, then the body thinks it's daytime and kicks in all of these responses. Suppresses melatonin, increases alertness, produces cortisol, increases heart rate and temperature, as if it was daytime. Some of the other functions of this system in non-human organisms include photoperiodism and seasonality, which uses the same system, so the ability to detect day length, or more specifically night length. The scotoperiod is what this system detects. So seasonally breeding animals maintain their breeding cycles through this circadian photoreceptor, through this non-image forming photoreceptor. And animals that use the sun to navigate, such as birds and butterflies, also require an internal clock in order to make sure they can calculate how far the sun has moved in the sky through time. And so this same system underpins photoperiodism, seasonality, and solar navigation. And so we're calling this system a non-image forming photoreceptor system, just to distinguish it from the image forming photoreceptor system, so vision. But this is a separate system that has separate neuroanatomy, a separate photoreceptor, separate photopigments, and controls a whole set of different behaviors. And so when we want to think about this non-image forming photoreceptor system, we think of some of these properties of light, and I'm not going to go through all of these in detail today. I'm just going to really talk about the first two. But we have to think about how light affects our non-image forming system as well as our vision. And so light intensity, to start with, is a very important component of this system. And I show these data to give you a sense of the dynamic range at which light affects your circadian rhythms, your melatonin, and potentially sleep. So these are laboratory studies where we've exposed people to white light for 6.5 hours at night. So you can consider that an imitation of a night shift, where someone might work for 6 or 7 or 8 hours at night. And we expose people to increasing illuminance of light. So if you expose people to somewhere between 1,000 or 10,000 lux of light at night, that fully suppresses their melatonin rhythm. You get nearly 100% suppression. If you expose people at night to a few tens of lux, then we can't detect a response in this experiment, although that's not to say it's inert, but you can see a much lower response to light if we give only 10 lux exposure. But you get the full dynamic range of response between about 20 or 30 lux of light up to maybe the low hundreds, 400-500 lux of light.
Sorry, Steve,
and so you can go from virtually no suppression of melatonin to complete suppression of melatonin in just a few hundred lux. And these are light levels that, of course, we are routinely exposed to at night. So any office worker working nights, any shift worker working nights is exposed to light in this dynamic range. And even a bedside lamp or the lights you use indoors at night are in this range of several hundred lux. And so the type of light you're exposed to at night, whether you're a shift worker or just going to bed later than your melatonin onset, is having a distinct biological effect on your circadian clock and on your melatonin level. And so just a few hundred lux will give you nearly a maximal response. And so here I mark on what 100 lux does. It gives you 50% of the effect of 1,000 to 10,000 lux. So 100 lux exposure is a very powerful exposure at affecting our biology. On the left-hand panel here, this is the same experiment, but now we looked at how much the clock had been shifted by light. And again, up at about 1,000 or so lux, you can fully shift the clock by 3 hours. So that would be the equivalent of adapting from Boston time to California time. But 100 lux of light, which you can easily get from a bedside lamp, shifts you halfway there, about an hour and a half of a shift. And so again, this amount of light is able to shift the clock in a powerful way. In the same experiment, we looked at some of those markers of alertness. And so you can see here that if you rate people's subjective alertness, they rate themselves much more alert under bright light than under dim light. The rate of those slow rolling eye movements are much lower in bright light compared to dim light. And if we look at brain activity, look at theta and alpha power in the EEG, the electroencephalogram, so we measure brain waves as a measure of alertness, you can see that there are fewer of these waves at high light intensity, which shows that the brain is more alert compared to when they're exposed to dim light. And again, if we mark on the effect of 100 lux of light, you can see that we get at least a 50% response and sometimes a near maximal response with only 100 lux of light. So these are very powerful light stimuli, the types of light you're exposed to indoors at night. If we move on now to the wavelength of light, 2 studies came out in 2001 which showed that this non-image forming photoreceptor system is not mediated by the rods and cones that you use for vision. So of course the rod sensitivity to different colors of light peaks at about 510 nanometers, the scotopic function, and the 3-cone visual photopic function peaks at around 555 nanometers. If you construct action spectra for the effects of light on melatonin suppression, you can see that the peak sensitivity occurs at a much shorter wavelength at around 460 nanometers in these 2 separate experiments. And so these action spectra don't match the spectral sensitivity for the rod or the cone photoreceptor system. And so this is evidence in humans of a novel photoreceptor system that isn't matching that of the rods and cones. And in fact, there's been a whole set of work over the past 15 years in both animals and humans proving that there is a novel photoreceptor system. And the photopigment detecting light is called melanopsin, which shouldn't be confused with melatonin. It's a completely separate substance. But melanopsin is the photopigment that is most sensitive to blue light. And this opsin is located in the ganglion cell layer of the eye. It's not located in the photoreceptor layer. And so, in fact, you can completely destroy the photoreceptor layer. You can take out all the rods and cones, and you can still have a fully functional non-image forming photoreceptor system. So it has very distinct neuroanatomy and function. And so we have this non-image forming photoreceptor system which is more sensitive to blue light. And here's an example in some of our experiments. We looked at melatonin suppression over 6.5 hours of blue light exposure. And you can see that on average the blue light suppressed 90% of the melatonin compared to green light which only suppressed about 40%. And this tells us that this melanopsin system is primarily responsible for suppressing melatonin, because if the cone system was doing this work, the green light would have been more effective than the blue, because 555 nanometers is the peak sensitivity of the 3-cone photopic photoreceptor system. If we look at the alerting effects of light, we see the same type of result. Again, this is a 6.5-hour exposure to light at night, and the blue light is much better at making people feel alert compared to green. They have a quicker reaction time under blue light compared to green, and they have fewer lapses of attention. So these are responses that are longer than half a second. This is important if you're driving a car or if you're looking at a safety board in a nuclear power plant. If you miss things because you have a lapse of attention, this can have serious safety consequences, and there were much fewer of these lapses in blue light exposure compared to green. Some colleagues of ours in Montreal, Gilles van der Waal and colleagues, are also looking at brain activity under different colours of light. And I won't go into this in too much detail, but just to show you that when you image the brain, you can see also blue light sensitive changes in brain activity. And so areas of the brain involved in alertness, performance, memory, and even mood are more activated by blue light compared to green, or by blue light compared to violet. And so you can actually see the brain react more quickly to blue light as a measure of this photoreceptor system. And so to summarize some of these effects of light at night, non-image forming light exposure at night stimulates multiple neuroendocrine and neurobehavioral systems. It shifts the timing of the circadian pacemaker, so it desynchronizes the internal circadian clock. It suppresses the pineal hormone melatonin, so it abolishes the biochemical signal of night. It alerts the brain and disrupts sleep because the body thinks it's daytime. And stimulation of hormones, increase in heart rate and other physiology means that this light has a widespread impact on physiology and metabolism. We in fact have clocks all over the body. Your lungs, your heart, your kidneys, your pancreas, all organs, it seems, have a clock. And so all of these organs need to be aligned internally in order to keep our metabolism working properly. And so circadian misalignment and sleep disruption caused by light exposure at night if you're a shift worker underlie the increased risk of accidents and injuries, heart disease, metabolic disorders and diabetes and cancer, as you'll see in a moment, in shift workers. And so if you don't get that natural light-dark exposure, your body metabolism can't time itself properly, and this has long-term health risks. And this is caused by inappropriate exposure to light at night, because shift workers should be asleep at night, not awake at night. And in fact, the World Health Organization rated shift work that involves circadian disruption as a probable carcinogen. And so we think that short sleep duration and circadian disorders are associated with an increased risk of heart disease, hypertension, stroke, obesity, diabetes, and there are even some studies to suggest that short sleepers have shorter lives. And so if you're exposed to a lot of light at night, that disrupts your sleep, that disrupts your circadian rhythms, and has these potentially long-term health risks. In Alzheimer's patients, if you improve the day-night difference, remember I told you at the start of the talk that you want bright days and dark nights. If you do that by increasing the amount of light people are exposed to in the daytime, you can get a better sleep-wake cycle in demented patients, in Alzheimer's patients, compared to what they're currently exposed to. And it's been shown recently in a study published last year that this improved light exposure and improved darkness at night can have measurable effects on cognition and on depression in Alzheimer's patients to the same degree as many of the medications that are used to treat this disorder. And so light-dark control has potentially serious consequences for treating Alzheimer's patients and may in fact avoid the need for them to go into care homes, which is part of the problem of having these disordered rest activity cycles. I don't have enough time to go into this in a great deal of detail, but as I mentioned, melatonin is the hormone of darkness. We detect season by using melatonin. During the winter, we produce a longer duration of melatonin production compared to the summer, so we can detect changes in season. But there are, of course, many things that you can do to disturb this, and light is a major way to disturb this signal. And some beta blockers also suppress melatonin. And so we are able to detect night length, and we should have longer nights in winter compared to the summer.
Sorry, Stephen, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, if we could just wrap up in the next minute or two, please, that'd be great.
No problem. This is the last couple of slides.
Thanks.
And so I want to just mention that in our animal experiments, suppressing melatonin is associated with an increased tumor growth rate. And so there's not a direct link yet with light exposure and cancer in humans, but there's a lot of epidemiology to suggest it's important, and animal experiments show that if you take out the pineal gland, you can increase tumor growth rates. If you expose people to constant light or increase light exposure, you can increase tumor growth rates. And so here in some animal experiments done by Blask and colleagues, the intensity of light is directly related to tumour growth rates. Now, this is not true for all cancers, this is not true for all models, but in cancers that have been studied that are sensitive to melatonin, light intensity is associated with an increased risk in tumour growth. There's a lot of epidemiology to show that people who are exposed to light at night have higher cancer rates. So female shift workers have about a 50% increased risk compared to blind women who seem to have a 50% reduction in risk. And so this is intriguing evidence that light may be important in cancer risk. And if you have blind subjects who have little circadian disruption, they have low cancer risk. Night shift workers have a lot of melatonin and circadian disruption, they have high cancer risk. We need to understand more about what your day-to-day disruption by light pollution, by using light at night, has on your cancer risk. And experiments are ongoing to try and study this at the moment. If you want to know more about this, there's a whole conference on this recently in New York. If you go to the New York Academy of Sciences website, there's a whole set of lectures and talks about how light and melatonin may be important for cancer risk. And so, just to summarize, you need good light-dark cycles to entrain the circadian system. Even dim light exposure at night can have widespread effects on physiology. Chronic disruption of circadian rhythms has serious consequences. Light pollution at night has potential to harm human health, but we need to do more research to understand how much light is important and then measure those effects to have the evidence that light exposure is damaging. Light days and dark nights are required for good physiology, and so we must try and live a sleep-friendly, melatonin-friendly, and dark-friendly lifestyle at night to make sure we maintain good human health. Thank you very much. Sorry for going over slightly. I'd be happy to entertain questions. I realise you're trying to catch the sunset, but people can send me their questions by email. I'm very happy to receive them, and we can have some dialogue to try and discuss this a bit further. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Maybe round of applause. Maybe we have time for just one quick question, if anybody.
How about...
hang on, Vim, till I bring the microphone over to you.
How about the people living in the poles? Are they
correct? That's an excellent question. So, people in the poles who are exposed to only natural light or very little artificial light do have higher rates of health problems. There are higher depression rates, there are higher rates of alcoholism that are associated with more northerly latitudes. And so living in constant dark for half the year and constant light for the rest of the year isn't a healthy state to be in. Of course, now we override that with the use of artificial light. But even with access to artificial light, disease rates tend to be higher in those northerly latitudes. And so there is evidence in that group that lack of exposure to powerful light-dark cycles causes problems. And that's true, of course, in the Antarctic and in people who are not exposed to proper light-dark. So if you think about hospital patients, the Alzheimer's patients I showed you, prisons, places where people are not getting good light-dark exposure, health is impacted by that. We do need distinct 24-hour patterns.
Okay, thanks very much, Stephen. I guess people can follow up with you on your email address and website. So just another round of applause, really, for everyone. So, Stephen, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.